Welcome to our discussion on pandemic economics and the road ahead. This is another in a series of podcasts and webinars sponsored by the New York chapter of the Counselors of Real Estate. For those of you that don't know, the Counselors of Real Estate are prominent real estate practitioners recognized for their expertise, experience, and ethics in providing advice that influence real estate decisions. I'm Tom Fink with Trepp LLC, a data and analytics firm based in New York City. I'll be your host today. As an administrative note, you can submit questions live through the Q&A window in the WebEx application. Today's session will be recorded and made available to registrants later today. Joining me today are fellow counselors of real estate, Julia Hoagland, one of the leading residential real estate brokers in New York City, and Neil Madsen, the president of the New York chapter, a real estate consultant and asset manager with global experience. And joining us as our special guest is Greg Heim, Executive Vice President and Chief Economist at Terra Holdings. Neil, would you give the audience an overview of what we're trying to accomplish today?
Sure, thanks, Tom. As this year's chair of the New York Metropolitan Chapter of the Counselors of Real Estate, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you this morning. In addition to the attributes that Tom mentioned, counselors of real estate are also known for innovation and creative problem solving. We have a very big problem. And the purpose of these webinars is to help us understand the size, the shape, the nature, the potential ramifications of this problem from as many vantage points as possible. And with frequent updates as new information becomes available, as is happening right now with initial unemployment claims as we speak, so that we can better assess the pandemic's impact on real estate in order that we as counselors can become part of the solution as we advise our clients on their real estate interests. That's a lofty objective, but with our deep base of expertise, experience, and ethics, our organization is uniquely capable of pursuing it meaningfully. And the speakers today are well positioned to help us do so. With that, Julia and Greg, I'll turn things over to you to get started, and Tom and I will pop back in with questions from participants in a few minutes. Julia. I think you might be.
Am I live?
Yes, you're live.
All right. Glad we found you.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm having a couple of technical difficulties. I can hear myself, but not you guys.
Oh.
One moment, my apologies. Okay, how's this?
Better now.
We can see
Here we are.
Sorry about that. Okay, welcome. Thank you, Neil. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm Julia Hoagland, and I specialize in Manhattan real estate, residential real estate, and I'm delighted to be here with everyone today and to introduce my friend, Greg Heim. As Tom mentioned, Greg is a chief economist with Terra Holdings, and he's been with the organization for 17 years. Prior to his career at Terra Holdings, Greg was the chief economist of Rebney for 8 years, and he started his illustrious career at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So thank you so much for being here, Greg.
Well, it's always a pleasure. And speaking of labor statistics, since Neil mentioned it, jobless claims did fall last week, 2.981 million, slightly higher than expected, but the sixth straight week of decline. So kind of a 50-50 report, depending on how you want to look at it. Well, just wanted to be breaking up to the minute news.
I'm going to take that as a green shoot, which I will ask you about later.
Okay.
So the structure of today's discussion is we're going to start off with a lightning round to get us all in the economic mood. And then I'll take Greg through a discussion of the current economy, the Fed stimulus, liquidity programs, inflation, interest rates, and work to integrate everything in terms of its impact on the Manhattan and US real estate markets. And then we'll finish it off. We'll go into the Q&A, which will be moderated by Neil and Tom, and we'll finish it off with a lightning round. So Greg, are you ready?
Bring the lightning. Sure, go ahead.
Okay, please, short, succinct, one-word answers if possible. COVID-19, just another economic disruption or in a class all its own?
All its own.
Okay. Will the federal government bail the states out?
Yes.
Is COVID the death of globalization?
No.
Do cities have a future?
Yes.
Over under, 80% of jobs lost are temporary.
Under.
All right. So going back to the first lightning round question, pre-COVID, we had low unemployment, good job growth, record high stock market, low interest rates, strong GDP, and GDP contracted 4.8% in quarter one, even though most of quarter one was pre-COVID. So please help us understand where we are now and where you think we're going.
Well, where we are now is in a very bad recession, which we hope will be very temporary. You know, the unemployment number that came out last week was just under 15%. We've never seen a number that high. Employment data doesn't really go back to the Great Depression, but obviously it was higher then. But it looks like before things turn around, our unemployment rate could easily cross 20%, which would be Great Depression level era numbers, and would be devastating. There's no question that any way you look at the economic data right now, I mean, we're halfway through the second quarter now, almost exactly. And the GDP number could be negative 30% for the second quarter. I mean, there's been forecasts higher and lower than that. But I mean, I think we have to view these numbers in the light of what's been going on. We do expect a quick rebound to the economy, but it's not going to be an actual V. I know V-shaped is used a lot. It's wishful thinking, but it's not like we're going to flip a switch and everybody's going back to work and we're going to be back to 3.5% unemployment and record this and record that. So I think with this, the real recovery begins when, you know, treatments are available, vaccines are too far off, but we have to have a containment of the virus, and having antibody tests seemed to be a good thing. I got one. I found out my results, which actually made me feel good because I have had this. So, but now you find out that, well, maybe there's a lot of false positives. So I think we know what we need to do to fix this. This isn't like a financial thing where we throw a bunch of things and hope something sticks. We know what needs to be done, and it's the science side of this. So I think this is going to be the deepest recession we've ever seen, but it should be one of the shortest ones at the same time.
Okay. So along those lines, the Great Recession was clearly a financial and housing markets issue, whereas 9/11 was a black swan event. And clearly COVID is more of a black swan event than a financial or housing markets issue. How do you feel that the experience that we'll have economically will track that, the post experience will track that of 9/11, and what's going to cause it to veer off?
Well, I think the uncertainty and the fear of, you know, 9/11 was a fear of another attack. I mean, working in Manhattan, as you know, most of us do, you just felt like it was going to become almost a frequent event. And I think that people slowly came back to work, you know, and downtown took a little bit longer. But I think all of a sudden people are now used to, and you still see, you know, police and military armed with machine guns at train stations, and it's become a new norm where that's the world we have to live in. And I think this is obviously very similar in that regard, where people are afraid that this is going to come back in the fall, that seeing people wearing masks and social distancing are going to be the new norm. For how long, who knows? And, you know, logistically, 9/11, if you work downtown, you couldn't go to work, you know, for a period of time, depending on how close you were. And I think that's another similarity. Like, I can't go to work right now. I can't get on the train. I can't get to the office building. Luckily, I can work. And obviously, telecommuting has come a long way in 19 years. So it makes it easier to be productive at home. But the other thing, too, about 9/11 that we forget, and obviously it's not the same league, is there was a recession that began 6 months before September 11th. You know, we had seen the tech bubble begin to burst and a recession that had started in March of that year. But it, you know, I think that when you get this kind of shock, fear is a very serious thing to happen. And when people are afraid, they don't want to do a lot of anything. They don't want to invest. They don't want to buy things. You worry about your jobs. So, and there is this displacement now that is similar to 9/11. People, you know, living and working out of new environments to a great degree. So the last thing they're both going to have in common is we're going to get through them both, and you know, we'll be just as strong as we ever were.
This too shall pass, indeed. You've mentioned stimulus checks being less impactful without commerce. How much of the liquidity and the economic stimulus that the Fed has put into place is psychological versus actually impactful, in your opinion? And how is it going to help or not help the residential and commercial real estate markets?
Well, based on its size, it's 10% of U.S. GDP, or was at the time. Now GDP has contracted a bit, but $2.2 trillion is a lot of money. The psychological effect, I think, is minor in that, you know, it's good that people are getting taken care of. It's more relief. I mean, that's really what it's referred to as. It's not going to fix the problem. It's meant to be a temporary stopgap so people can pay their bills that they need to pay and keep their families afloat. But if I send out checks to everybody and they're using it to pay their rent or their mortgage payments and they're buying groceries and, you know, whatever they need, that's great, but that's not really going to stimulate the economy because it's really hard to buy expensive things right now. Even if you are lucky enough to still be working and, you know, getting paid a full salary, what can you really buy? You're not going to really, buying real estate is very difficult. You can't go look at it. You know, we do virtual showings and things of that nature. You're not necessarily going to buy a car or a major appliance, and you're not going to take a huge trip around the world because you can't really do that. So it's very hard. 70% of US GDP is consumer spending, roughly. So if we're finding it hard to spend money, even if we have it and want to spend it, you know, giving money to people that need it and businesses that need it just so they can keep the lights on is not really, I mean, restaurants are staying open, but they're, you know, not buying liquor because they can't really sell it. You know, they're not, they have to pay their staffs as much as they can, but that doesn't mean that can go on in perpetuity. So we're all, even if we do get working and we're getting paid and, you know, or we've received help, we're very careful about how we spend that because, you know, we don't know what's coming next. And I think that's also, you know, in the financial crisis, we tried an almost $1 trillion stimulus that really didn't do much to get the economy going again. It wasn't until we got to the root of that problem. So it's needed relief for people and governments and hospitals, but it's not going to turn things around by itself.
So let's talk about the stimulus that was put in. You mentioned several $1 trillion after the Great Recession was put in. We kept rates very low, and still we had no inflation. And you've actually indicated inflation is a thing of the past.
I didn't phrase it like that.
I did say indicated.
I said the old rules don't apply. You know, I spent a lot of time at business school and grad school learning about the Phillips curve and other theories of inflation that, you know, I mean, I always tell people, think about it. When was the last time inflation was a problem? And you have to go back a couple of decades. Mm-hmm. And I think that, yeah, the Great Recession is a great example. You know, when you print trillions of dollars in multiple rounds of quantitative easing and you keep rates near zero for not just months, but years, you don't see any inflation at all. You wonder what you would have to do to actually have inflation. And, you know, in a lot of ways, particularly inflation is good for real estate because real estate's a good hedge against inflation, you know, because prices are going up, prices of real estate are going up. Although as it's measured in the consumer price index, real estate is done a little crazy like. measured using something called owner's equivalent rent, which is, ask me what my house would rent for. I'll just make up a number. But I think that when you have an unemployment rate that's going to cross 20%, which I think will certainly happen at some point, you're not going to have enough consumer spending. One of the concerns that makes this different, I know that we could say that about a lot of things. This doesn't just affect demand, this virus, it affects supply, right? Anybody who's tried to get toilet paper or paper towels or Clorox wipes knows all about that. We would pay anything for these things right now. But the definition of too much money chasing too few goods, well, too much money, even with stimulus money, a lot of people are not, earning what they were earning before. And certainly with the stimulus running out at some point, that they have to worry about that. And, so I think that we have to remember that unless we're spending the money, unless the money supply is growing too, one of the things that happened a decade ago was banks held on to a lot of the money, in part because they had to, because of reserve requirements and the new rules that many banks and investment houses weren't subject to before that were now. And, banks would say, we would have lended it out gladly to anybody that wanted to borrow it, but they didn't necessarily have enough people looking. So for all those reasons, inflation is not a problem. The Fed will keep rates near zero for a very long time until they're confident that we're back on track.
So is there a limit to the federal debt? I mean, when do treasuries go out of favor? When does the U.S. become too leveraged?
Well, I don't know, because it's never happened. I think that, right now we do know that the federal government is planning on borrowing $3 trillion this quarter. Our national debt, is probably headed to 30 trillion when this is all said and done, most likely. And luckily right now, and the Treasury Secretary and other administration officials have said this, with rates being so low, they can borrow the money. And when the world goes crazy because of whatever, financial crisis or a pandemic or whatever you want to look at, everybody buys US Treasuries. And that model hasn't changed. I think that people still see it as the safest investment that you can get. And that's proven every day by the low rates we're paying on the debt. That was another fallacy we learned in college, that if the federal government was borrowing a lot of money, that would raise interest rates because it would increase demand. Now, with households having a record amount of debt and the federal government having a record amount of debt, again, you would be sure that rates must go up, right? Because there's only so much money out there to borrow. But apparently, no, it hasn't happened yet. And this is good because it'll keep mortgage rates low too. And there's been some difficulties on the residential side of people getting mortgages, and the government has taken some steps to alleviate that, which hopefully will work going forward.
Back to a comment you made earlier about the consumer being 70% more or less of economic activity. Do you feel that something will replace the consumer as that economic activity, the driver? How much is manufacturing, as an example, coming back to the U.S.?
Well, look, the biggest shift in this is, basically the GDP equation is consumer spending, government spending, investment, and then, trade. The government is going to pick up some of the slack by spending what it's spending. Manufacturing is less than 10% of the U.S. economy. So it's not, I know, and this, what a pandemic teaches you is that you need to make essential things in your country, because things can be very hard to get. We see what oil independence has done for this country. It's kind of like a kick in the head that oil prices are plummeting the way they are, and who needs to fill up their car, right? You would love to take a trip across America right now or somewhere with gas prices being this low, but you can't. I haven't filled up either of my cars since this began, and I live in Long Island. There's just nowhere to go. So I think that things like this do reshape economies through a variety of different ways. Innovation is one. You look at your business now with the idea that you can sell an apartment by walking through with an iPhone potentially and showing every room and do closings virtually. I think good things do come out. There's an expression I heard from, I'm forgive me, I can't remember the gentleman's name. He says his father always taught him adversity is a terrible thing to waste. And, out of this will come, just like out of wars come advances and shifts. If we do increase manufacturing here, I think that would be a good thing, particularly as it comes to medical equipment and protection equipment. I think this lesson has taught us about the need for preparedness and to make the essential items in this country. So I think that's more. Consumers will be back as soon as they feel secure about going outside and their jobs.
So can we talk a little bit more about reimagining, but in this, things that kind of innovation that comes from disruption, commercial real estate is something that's being talked about. Like, will the social distancing requirements increase need for commercial space, or will it be offset by the working from home trend that's been started, suddenly? And what will commercial and retail space be reimagined to look like if indeed it's not needed as much for what it's currently used for?
Well, it reminds me of after 9/11. I was working at Rebney. We had this thing, we had over 10 million square feet of office space destroyed on 9/11. We felt there was just going to be this big need for office space because companies that would be displaced. And we set up something called Space Bank. We had brokers volunteer. And then the phones didn't really ring that much because companies took another look and said, well, maybe we don't need that much space. And, maybe we pre-committed to too much space. I think it's a combination of two forces, as you said, fighting each other. One, with social distancing rules, tight cubicles, or a lot of spaces just have tables that people sit across from each other at. That's all going to have to change, and different measures. So you'd say, okay, well, that's going to increase the demand for space. Well, guess what? Companies are afloat right now, many of them, with nobody coming into the office.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these tech companies, like Twitter, has said, you guys never have to come back to work. And I think that side is going to win. I think that it will be a negative for demand for space, especially in retail. I mean, retail's obviously been suffering for many years, but I'm getting what I need online right now outside of groceries, and people will turn to like that convenience. I think retailers will want to, reduce their footprints, at least as soon as they can temporarily, not make any major commitments. I don't think we're going to see long-term leases in retail. I mean, that's been changing anyway, but I think commercial in general, I think companies see something like this can happen, and, they don't want to make a 10-year, 15-year commitment necessarily, knowing that 10 years is a business cycle. It's in some cases more than one. I mean, we just had the longest expansion in recorded U.S. history. So, you went in more than a decade without a recession, but I think people are going to be afraid of commitment, to speak frankly. So I think that side will win out. I know that my company and every company is scrambling right now to see how to reconfigure their offices and, where shields have to be put up and, or do flexible work schedules. Schools are going to do the same thing, it seems like. So I do think it will lead to it's going to be a net loss for demand for commercial real estate. That could change over time. And look, if we get a vaccine or this doesn't really come back hard in the fall, I think people might just, say, well, let's just wait it out and see what happens. But it's going to be like any aspect of real estate right now. It's not the time where people are going to make big commitments to anything.
I will switch gears a little bit to the tax base. The real estate industry feeds a lot of economic drivers for the city, including the city and state tax bases, but also appraisals and banking and construction and design, moving. I mean, the list goes on. Where do you see the real estate markets in the next 6 to 12 months after all of this?
Well, I think they're going to behave very similarly. I think that from a sales side, just like a decade ago, we're going to come out of this with no comps to look at. And, it's going to take a while to know where values need to be. A lot of people email me and say, well, how does this compare? How much did prices drop after Lehman Brothers? Will this be similar to that? And there's really no way to know. And I think because demand will come back at its own pace. We can open up everything tomorrow. It doesn't mean people are going to call you up and say, I want to look at that apartment, or call a commercial broker up and say, hey, here you have retail space available. I want to take a look at it. That will happen at people's own schedule and a very slow process. I think 6 months from now, we'll be busy. I think things will pick up, but especially when you look at closing prices, it's a very lagging indicator of where things are. And based on the activity or lack thereof, I mean, in the residential side, contract signings are down almost 80% year over year in Manhattan to buy apartments. And the dollars is even higher because the deals that are being signed are for significantly lower priced properties than they were a year ago. So I think it's going to be slow to come back. And I think we'll have to be really watching the data on all sides. And on the commercial side, it's the unknown about, tenants paying rent. Vornado announced last week that almost half their retail clients aren't paying rent. And that's to be expected. And a lot of businesses aren't going to pay rent. And if you took PPP loans, you have to keep people on payroll if you want it forgiven. So what's going to give there? Something has to. Your business is down significantly. So I think it's going to be a rough go. There's an election thrown in that 6-month period that, who knows? I think people are still angry about a lot of things, but I think a lot of us are trying to avoid that since it's not a pressing thing right at this moment. I think we're all trying to live day to day. So I think things will get busy probably in the mid to late summer. And then I think that'll lead to at least a market where we have a feel for pricing. Now, another thing is on the residential side, and to a lesser degree the commercial side, in many cases, prices had already been coming down. So to tell sellers, I think that we have to lower the price, and they're going to go, but I just lowered it, 15% before this all started. So I think it'll be a slow go. It'll be painful initially, and then I think people, commercial and residential, have to make decisions, and I think that will spur the market.
Okay, I have a final question for you before the Q&A. I'll let Tom and Neil come in with the Q&A. What are the 3 business models you feel are most in danger based on what's just happened of kind of losing viability? And then following up on that, there are always great dancers in disruptions in the economy. Who do you think is going to come in and and take advantage of all of this?
Well, I think on the retail side, anything consumer facing where large numbers of people gather, obviously those are the biggest losers right now. Restaurants, hospitality sector, hotels are taking a hit over this, and the airlines, or cruise ships. So anything retail based, unless you're a CVS or a drugstore or a supermarket, is really struggling right now. So much of that is large numbers of people, and obviously things that aren't allowed to be open, like theaters and arenas and things of that nature. I think the winners in this are companies like Amazon that can get people things very quickly. Also, with biotech being a huge field to begin with of growth, I think that there's a race right now to develop treatments and vaccines and to produce PPE. And I think anybody that can get that done, that will be a huge win going forward. So I think those are sort of the losers and the winners.
Okay, thank you. Tom and Neil, are there questions?
Yep, there are. So the first question we have is, to what extent will there be additional layoffs in order to right-size corporations as a result of the current downturn?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that we have to look at the high frequency data. So we're obviously watching weekly claims because you need consumers with money to keep companies afloat. And now that the number's under 3 million, that's certainly better than 6 million. But I think that more layoffs are inevitable because, and this, Julia asked me before, because 78% of the people surveyed during the employment report said that their layoffs were temporary. It's going to be a lot lower than that because companies, like they do after every crisis or recession, learn to do the same or more with less. Now, unfortunately, we can be so much more productive. So I think the layoffs will continue even after we're back in business as firms reevaluate how much money they want to spend on space, how much people that they need to do jobs. Because right now, in the real estate industry, some companies are furloughing a quarter or more of their workers. And they're going to realize that it's going to be a while till they even think about bringing those people back. And some of them are not going to come back, unfortunately. And I think so. It's going to linger for some time. Companies are always reevaluating their needs. Particularly Wall Street is very, very blunt about the need for people. And when you're no longer needed, you're gone, and that's unfortunate.
So here's a nice easy question for you, Greg.
Okay.
When will the city of New York start to lay off employees, cut their budget?
I mean, to some extent, they may claim that they have. Luckily, New York City had a couple of billion in a rainy day fund. I think going back to real estate and the tax base, real estate taxes account for 53% of New York City's revenue. Comes from, most of that is property tax. Now, property taxes tend to never seem to go down, right? Because on the residential side, there's kind of a really crazy system that they use using rental valuations to value co-ops and condos. But, the city has to be careful. One of the things that we've been looking at are transaction taxes. I mean, we pay a lot in commercial, you think about it, even more so on, transfers, particularly ones over $1 million. It's over $1 billion of revenue each year to the city just in transfer taxes alone. And I think that at some point something will have to give. I do think the federal government will have no choice but to bail states out. But one of the ways states balance their budget is cutting local aid, and we've already seen that in New York State, New York City. So I don't know. Obviously, this is a very progressive city with a progressive mayor who will do everything he can to avoid laying off government workers. But I think it will be, at least furloughing them will be an inevitability in many cases.
Here's a question. It feels to me like New York City is actually a long way off from getting back to life the way we used to live it here. I think the hospital system is a long way off from meeting Cuomo's criteria for reopening. I think that, pick your property type. If you're talking about office occupants, how are people going to use an elevator to get up to their workspace on the 37th floor? Do you wait in line, spaced 6 feet apart, all around the sidewalk, wrapped around the block, to get into an elevator all by yourself, or and then do the same thing in reverse on the way home? How do restaurants operate with kitchens that, there's no such thing as social distancing in a restaurant kitchen in New York City, and on and on and on. So, how long can New York stay down the way it's down right now and not just go into a very, very long-term funk, like, a decade or more of economic suppression?
I mean, 70s?
Yeah, I mean, the 70s is a good example. I mean, the other thing too, you're talking about state and city budgets. I mean, the city's payroll is a lot bigger back then. To answer your question, we've had everything is different. But if you think after 9/11, people said no one's ever going to live or work downtown again. New York City is going to be permanently under attack. People are never going to want to commute in. There's going to be this flight to the suburbs where it's safer. After Hurricane Sandy, we were worried about the viability of downtown office market as buildings were being flooded. No one was going to want to live near the water. I think that the resiliency of New York and the attitude of people who live here are ones that, we don't like to live in fear. And I think that we'll find ways to get through our day-to-day basis. Again, I mentioned before, every day when I come out of Penn Station, there are people with machine guns standing there. And that, concerned me when I initially saw them, but that's a fact of life, and I feel safer, and I'm able to go about my business. I think telecommuting will become a much huger part of work now, and I think that's going to be a new norm, and a lot of people will like that. And I don't expect to see a flight from New York City that is like the 70s or the 80s. I think people are already leaving the city, in part because of the reduction of the SALT deduction. Also the high taxes that are levied here, and more talk of things like pied-à-terre taxes and millionaires taxes, and that's going to be enough to push people out. There's only so much that, if people are worried about one thing, you throw other things, there are going to be people that leave, but we have the greatest economy in the world right here, and we have a very diverse job base. We have, whoever thought that companies like, Google and Amazon and Facebook would want such huge footprints in New York? Why? They could be anywhere. We lost the Amazon deal, but Amazon is still bringing people here. So I think it's the opportunity that New York City provides that will help it come back. I really do, and I think it's still the greatest city in the world. And I've been working in New York City for 28 years now, and I don't live in New York City, but you feel a sense of pride. This is where you work. It's a great place to be, and I think it takes a lot to scare off New Yorkers. This is different in that so much of our transit is subway. That's what really worries me, is when the only way most people get places is a very enclosed, scary thing. But I also have some faith that we're going to get better treatments, and that we're going to get through this. I mean, in Long Island, where I live, we were only meeting 2 out of the 7 conditions from reopening at the beginning of the week. Now we're meeting 5 of the 7. So, it's a fluid thing. We will adapt and we will adjust, and things may never be the same. But look at it this way: Wall Street was never going to be the same again, right? Because they no more proprietary trading, post Dodd-Frank world, things were all going to change. And Wall Street was doing just fine until this happened. So we will come out of this, and we will adapt.
So I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I don't know how many. We've got a long list that have come in from the audience, but you said at the very beginning that I think maybe Julia said you're going to take the decrease in unemployment claims as a green shoot. But here's the question is, in your mind, Greg, what should we be looking for to indicate the economy is back on track?
Well, I think the jobless claims are a good number, but you have to look at it in light of it. Like, the fact that jobless claims are declining while we're talking about reopening up, to me, is positive. Because if we were still months away from reopening, I would look at the decline skeptically, saying, well, yes, but this could shoot right back up tomorrow. Maybe firms got their PPP loans and they're holding on. So, it's sort of stopping the bleeding temporarily. But being that so much of America has begun to open up, and New York's going to begin to open up, I'm optimistic that maybe now we have seen we've seen the peak in unemployment claims. The lagging data that we see is only going to get worse, but I think you have to look at high frequency data, and that is the best indicator right now, looking at that. And obviously looking at, it's judging the economy's recovery is kind of like the governor's dashboard. They're looking at percentage of hospital beds being used, news cases, deaths. I think we have to look at that, job losses, and then look at what's being reopened, and really see, look, it's going to be very favorable when we come out of this, because rates are going to be so low. Anybody looking to borrow money will be able to get it cheap. And I think that people are chomping at the bit to get out and get used to whatever the new normal is. But I think right now I'm looking at the jobs, because we can't cure the virus right now, but if we can stop the job loss, that's we know when we'll hit a bottom. And when the employment numbers were released last week, the horrible and worst employment report ever, and the stocks were up because people are optimistic that maybe the worst is over.
So here's a question, another question from the audience. I think, Neil, we're gonna have to make this the last one, because I think we're getting really close to the end.
Agree.
It's like 3 questions lumped together, but I'm going to take a piece of this one.
Okay.
Premise is many restaurants won't make it. And Julia, this is for you and Greg. What do you think that will do to residential neighborhood values? And how will that impact the commercial lenders, with the landlords having to pay their mortgages?
Greg, do you want to go first, and then I'll...
Yeah, well, I obviously it's not good for values in real estate, but I think because people come here for the great restaurants, but they also come here for other things that are in question too. They come here for the theater. They come here, for other events that are going to be permanently altered as well. But in a city as big as New York City, where population is expected to eventually hit 10 million people at some point, you're going to need those restaurants. I think they're going to close, but I believe other ones will open in their place. And, if people find a happy mix, I know when I go to lunch or dinner in Manhattan, I wouldn't mind being a little further apart from people. It is kind of a tight thing. Again, I think that people come here, all the other things are really nice. I think people come here because of the economy and the job base that we have. And the fact that the city is the safest big city in the world, essentially. And I think people will be understanding about restaurants. It doesn't help for sure, but I don't think you could say, well, values are going to go down by X% because restaurants will be closing. What do you think, Julia?
I think it hinges on the reimagination of the space, and some of that will definitely be into restaurants, because that's a basic need of people and a basic want of people. And I know things like a vacancy tax are very controversial, but I do think that there will be, and I'm a residential specialist, not a commercial specialist, but I have to imagine that at some point it's going to be worth it for the commercial landlords to perhaps rethink what it is that they need from these tenants in order to get them back in, and work with them more in some ways than others. And that's kind of the limit of my expertise in that, but it's a need. And I agree. I've been in, Manhattan, and there are empty storefronts in my neighborhood that I don't love. But I'm not planning on moving because of that. And I do have hope that it's going to go back to,
just to answer Tom's point about the lenders too, and the landlords, there's a very dangerous movement going on right now, on the residential commercial side of rent strikes and, allowing people to forego rent and need mortgage payments and such. There are people in great need, and we need to help them as much as we can. But this is morphed into something much bigger, that the people just feeling that they don't have to pay rent. And, landlords now are talking about it, property tax strike. I don't know if it's just a couple of very vocal ones, but I think that the city and state have to realize is you can't tell people they don't have to pay their rent, and businesses don't have to pay their rent, and leave the landlords holding the bag and the lenders holding the bag, because that's not fair. And I think, landlords have this bad stereotype of looking like the monopoly guy, or somebody who just goes everywhere in a limousine and can afford to give anything back. And I think as a city, we have to be very cognizant of that. And, rent regulations has permanently shaped the landscape of buildings right now, where nobody's ever going to want to renovate their building again if there's rent regulated units in it. And I think that's something to be concerned over too. The progressive governments in Albany and downtown have to be aware of the damage some of these laws, many done with good intentions, are going to have on the commercial side and the lending side.
Well, Greg and Julia, first, let me thank you for this fascinating look at the road ahead. Neil, thanks for joining me as a co-host. We are at our time right now. We told people 45 minutes. It's 9:15. I have a feeling we could go for another 45 minutes if we just let it run. But be that it is, I also want to thank the audience for joining us this morning. Great questions. The one we didn't get to, I just have to repeat anyway. The last one that came in is no rent, no mortgage, no banks. Something to think about as we go away. One other thing for everyone on the call. At 2 p.m. today, the Counselors of Real Estate National Chapter will be hosting a national webinar featuring fellow CRE Richard Barkham, who is the Global Chief Economist and Head of America's Research for CBRE. So that's out there too if you're interested. And it is our colleague in the CRE, Casey Conway, likes to say, look up and forward. With that, thank you for coming. Everyone have a good day. Stay safe. Keep your social distance. Goodbye.